Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third session of OSU Extension's Virtual Soil Health Series. I'm Mary Griffith, the OSU Extension educator in Madison County, Ohio, and today we're going to take a look at what the research says about if improving soil health can improve your yields. So here today is Jordan Wade. He's a postdoc at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I'm really excited to hear from him today. He's got some research he's going to share and show you about what soil health can do for your yields. So welcome, Jordan. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you, Mary. Here, let me get set up and we are. All right. Well, thank you everybody for showing up this morning. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about some work that we did during my PhD with Steve Coleman. And so it mainly focused on this question of can improving soil health improve yields? So to start off, I want to just kind of take the 10,000 foot view here to make sure that we're all on the same page a little bit. So when we're talking about soil health, a lot of the times people like to talk about management, right? And there's lots of different combinations of management that we can put together on your farm for any given field. People at like USDA and whatnot have put together this kind of synthesis of like, okay, here are some guiding soil health principles. So these might be familiar to you. So the big four are keep the soil covered, to minimize disturbance, keep plants growing throughout the year, diversify the plants, and then some people also like to add on incorporate livestock. So when we have that management, it has some sort of effect, right? And when that effect is reflected in something like soil health indicators. So when we go out and we do some sort of soil health assessment using those indicators, that's how we see, or that's one way that we can see the effects of whatever management we're trying out, right? So we usually see these broken down into three different parts. So we have chemical components of soil, a physical component of soil, and a biological component of soil, and management can affect each of those. Now, as Mary has kind of already alluded to, and as I'm sure many of you fully internalize and know, those effects of management on soil health indicators are not the same everywhere. There are lots of things that can affect how management changes our soil health assessment. So things like climate, right? If you're in Northern Ohio, it's going to obviously be very different than what's going on in Southern Ohio. Things like geology, right? Where are you? Are you in the heavy soils, or are you kind of more on the Western till plain there? How long you've had a management in place. What's happening at year 1 is not going to be the same thing that's happening at year 10 or year 20, who knows? And so things also like soil texture, all of these affect and have some influence on the way that management is reflected in our soil health indicators and our soil health assessment. So then once we have that assessment, those indicators and those results from that, we want to then move to some sort of outcome, right? And the outcome that you're looking for might vary, but there are a couple different things that a healthy soil might do are things like high plant productivity or just kind of supporting physical type of things like plant growth, for example. Healthy soil also will cycle nutrients, allow water to move through it, and while the water is moving through it, it might even filter some potential pollutants, right? So these are lots of things that a healthy soil can do. And we want to know how well do these indicators connect to some sort of outcome, right? Now, of course, today we want to focus on just this one particular piece, So we want to say, how do soil health indicators connect to yields? And specifically, I want to talk about nitrogen use efficiency to really get specific about it. So the real kind of big picture question here is, do these biologically active soils, these healthy soils, produce greater yields than less active or less healthy soils? So during my PhD, this was some work that we did across the Midwest and across the Corn Belt. You can see here, this is kind of the distribution of sampling points that we had. As you can see down here, plenty of sites in Ohio, a little bit blank spot in the Northeast Ohio. This is a combination of on-farm trials. If you participated in the tri-state fertilizer recommendations, we pulled a lot from that project. But these are all rain-fed corn systems, and these are all nitrogen rate trials. So we used a minimum of 4 nitrogen rates, and so we needed a true 0 N plot, and then we had N rates all the way up, depending on the field, up to almost 250 pounds. So pretty good range of nitrogen rates here. But then also we wanted to layer on top of this, we wanted to have a wide range of kind of soil health practices, right? Those principles that we were talking about. We wanted to represent a big range of soil health. So for example, when we are talking about cover crops, we had everything from things that were winter fallow. We had barley cover crops. We had annual rye as a cover crop. We had some radish, and then we had clover. So pretty good range, different types of cover crops. You have end fixers and then some that are more just producing lots of biomass. Then we also had variations in tillage. So we had everything from chisel plow, mold board, and then we had plenty of no-till sites as well, which many of you have already said makes a big difference for you. So then we also had different types of rotations in the mix here. So as you can see, there's lots of different forms, but we had continuous corn, lots of corn, soybean. We had corn, soybean, and corn, soybean. Then we also had corn, soy, wheat, and even just corn, wheat. So lots of different rotations, and we also had some sites that even had included manure. So I'm going through this just to tell you that we got a good range of healthy soils and things, good representation of values that we could have here. So I know it's early, so I felt like I should probably give this warning that a little bit of statistics talk. I'm hoping it's going to be really easy, really accessible, but it really makes a big difference to how we can interpret these results. And so I want to emphasize how what I'm going to be talking about here is slightly different from a lot of other studies. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the way that we measured soil health, right? So a lot of studies, what they will do is they'll go out and they'll measure one indicator and they say, well, this measurement goes up or down, and this is how that relates to soil health. But the thing with soil health, and I think this is something that makes it challenging, is soil health is not something that we can directly measure, right? Just like human health. So human health, you know, we take our blood pressure and we take our temperature, you know, how you sleep in, you take cortisol levels, whatever it might be. But all of those things kind of represent human health. But similarly, soil health has lots of different things that we can combine together, right? But unlike humans, we can't go to soil and just ask it how it's feeling. So it's a little bit more complicated. So here what we did is we created this kind of blended variable. It's a blend of a couple different soil health indicators. Now, Steve did a good job last week of describing a bunch of these indicators, so I'm not going to try and rehash too much of that, but I did want to just mention them. And for anyone who didn't see last week, just give a quick overview of what they might be. So the first one is POX, or POXy, which is one of the soil health indicators that we work with, or permanganate oxidizable carbon. So what this is it's just a little bit of oxidation applied to organic matter. And this is part of the organic matter that is thought to be more active and biologically cycling, right? So this is part of the microbial food web, if you will. Up next is respiration. So just like humans, when we're working hard, we are breathing out lots of CO2, and soil microbes do the same thing. So respiration, we think of that as how hard the soil microbes are working. So that is another measure of soil health. It's another kind of active portion of your total soil organic matter. We also measure just total organic matter. So this would be organic matter measurements that you get on your kind of standard agronomic soil test. You get back pH and your extractable P and K and all that kind of stuff, and you usually get organic matter on that as well. So we use that measurement as well. And then the last one is soil protein. Now, proteins are kind of everywhere in soil, and they're really nitrogen rich. So we included that in our kind of blended soil health variable here. Now, I'll spare you on some of the specifics, but we go through this process to say, which ones of these should we keep? Do we need to measure all of these? Which ones are giving us new information, and which ones are kind of redundant for our purposes here? So when we did that, we found that respiration kind of fell out. It was not giving us any unique information that these other indicators weren't, at least when it comes to nitrogen. So we excluded that, and we ended up with just 3 of these indicators for our kind of final blended variable here. So we have, again, the permanganate oxidizable carbon, this organic matter from your standard agronomic test, and soil protein, which is a big nitrogen pool in soils. Okay, so then we need to take that new blended variable and start putting it together with other things that we know, other nitrogen management tools that are conventionally used. So first we have, remember, this blended soil health variable with these 3 measurements. Up next, we have your pre-plant nitrate. So your soil nitrate in the surface before you are planting anything or putting down any fertilizer. And then we also have your nitrogen rate, right? So these are kind of 3 different parts of your nitrogen budget. We have what's there, soil health, thinking that soil health might be representing what is to come, right? What is going to be mineralized from your organic matter, and your nitrogen rate, what you're adding. So we want to know how all 3 of those come together to inform yield, right? Now, of course, there are kind of these lingering questions about how these other pieces fit together, right? So what we did is we also made connections between those. So we have here nitrogen rate. We were thinking nitrogen rate might also be influencing soil health, and soil health might be influencing how much nitrate we have pre-plant. So we kind of put those together in a fancy statistical model here. And again, what we found was that one of these things kind of falls out. So your pre-plant nitrate didn't seem to be, across all of these sites, it didn't seem to be as good a predictor of yield as soil health and nitrogen rate. So that's kind of like one of the first important things that we found here. The next one is that improved soil health does actually increase yields, which was great news. And, you know, it's hard to put a precise number on it so far because, again, this is one study and we don't want to give too concrete a recommendation yet, but it equates to about a 10% increase, relative increase in soil health is about a 5% increase in yields. Now, these are both kind of relativized, right, to wherever you are. Everyone has a different starting place for their field soil health and their yield potential. So these are relative increases. Then the other thing that is kind of interesting and of note is that nitrogen fertilizer does actually increase soil health. So we need nitrogen, those nitrogen applications are also helping to run the gears of the soil microbial community as well. So those are kind of the three most important findings, right? So what does this mean? What are the implications of this? So first, something that we all often think and can observe, but often is difficult to verify across lots and lots of fields across a big geographic range. First off, that healthy soils are in fact more productive, right? The other kind of implication here is that if you are using kind of these soil health building practices, the things that increase your soil health and specifically are increasing these soil health indicators here, you do have some cushion for your nitrogen application. So that what this means is if you are applying nitrogen and you're not sure if you should add that extra little bit or not, if you've been increasing your soil health, if these indicators have gone up, you can maybe hold off on that extra little bit and think of the soil health as a little bit of an insurance policy for that you won't get some huge yield hit. Now, I know what everyone says always, right? Every field is different. This is something that soil scientists have always said. This is something that we've seen, et cetera. But this is something that we, from the get-go, wanted to incorporate in this study. So usually what happens is you go out and you have these different fields. So each of these fields is a different color. And you have a bunch of different observations from that field. So one thing that a lot of people do, and it works pretty well for something like a soil phosphorus test, and thinking whether to fertilize there, is what they do is they take it and they throw it all together and they say, here's the relationship between here, we think about it in terms of soil health and yield, but it could just as easily be soil test phosphorus, right? They throw every single observation there and see what happens. But what is often the case is you can see here that things start to cluster by field, right? So we see here all the green dots are together, all the red, all the purple, all the yellow, all the blue. And so it doesn't really help us on any individual field make any decision, right? So that's one kind of way that previous studies have dealt with this kind of every field is different type of issue. Another way is that people start to just average all of the observations from a field, which maybe isn't super helpful for you specifically making a management decision, right? Because every field truly is different, but we just want to figure out how to juggle those two things. So what we did here in this study is we have lots of fields. We had 30-something fields and lots of observations from each field. But what we did is we wanted to ask, is the relationship between soil health and yield the same across every field, right? So if I'm getting some improvement in soil health, some consistent improvement in soil health from field to field here, am I going to see a consistent increase in yields, relative yields for my field? And so that is how we structure this. And what it lets us say then is it lets us say, no matter where your field is, no matter where you are starting on your kind of inherent soil health, if you're moving this direction and you're increasing soil health, you should have a pretty consistent yield increase, okay? Now, I'm gonna start wrapping up here, but I did want to take some time, and I know a lot of you gave input last week on some questions, and I wanted to make sure to touch on them. So a couple that came up over and over that I wanted to talk about how they relate to this study. So first is people ask, what managements should I use? Now, if you remember back to my first slide, I was mentioning that management as it affects your soil health indicators, our soil health assessments, vary by lots of different things. You know this, right? So my answer here is it will depend. Get your soil tested. Let the indicators and your kind of in-field experience tell you if you're going in the right direction. Okay, up next is where can I get my soil tested for soil health measurements? So there are a couple commercial options. So there's Brookside Labs, which is here in Ohio. There's also Ward Lab. They're also really fantastic. And there are university labs. So Cornell has this comprehensive assessment of soil health, they call it. And then there's also University of Missouri has what they call the Soil Health Assessment Center. I will make a small plug for the University of Missouri. I will be starting there as the director of their Soil Health Assessment Center, and they do a really high volume of soil tests each year, farmer soil tests specifically, from their cover crop share program there. So, they're used to running a lot, and you should get results back fairly quickly. Up next, and this is a huge burning question, is how do I interpret my soil test for nitrogen management, right? I just told you about how these specifically relate to nitrogen. So how can you make sure that you're heading in the right direction? So, there's a couple caveats here. So if you're sampling your soils at the same time and sending the samples to the same lab, you right now just want to see that those values are increasing. It's not about the absolute value of them. It's about if you're going in the right direction. So things like that permanganate oxidizable carbon, the organic matter, and soil protein, you just want them to be going up. Unfortunately, that's a little rough right now, but that's because we haven't quite fully ironed it out, precise values yet and whatnot. As Steve said last week, it is not a direct path to success, but it is it's a long and winding one. So we're moving towards it though. So up next is how long are these soil health tests applicable to end fertility decisions? So one thing about this study is we used average corn yields for 5 years after our soil sample. So if these soil health tests are a little expensive, or they can be, so you want to make sure that you don't have to do this every year per se. So you can project out a little bit from these results, and you should have some confidence here. And it's not every year, but this is on average, you should be seeing that relationship between soil health and yields. And of course, the big question is how much less nitrogen can I apply? We are not quite there yet in terms of having that level of precision. We'd hate to misguide you, but I will say stay tuned. This is a great question that we are still working on, and we will get back to you. So with that, I want to just say thank you for coming, and I'm ready for questions, comments, and anything else you might have.
Thank you so much, Jordan. We do have a few questions in the chat, and Steve's here too. Steve Coleman was our speaker from last week, and he and Jordan worked on this together. And so they're both here and can both answer questions. Steve's put a link to this study in the chat for anyone that's interested in looking at that. Again, you can ask questions in the Q&A. I have a few in there, and if you want to upvote any, you can do that. You can like the ones that you have the same question. So the first question that came in is, what was the common nitrate number that you saw, if there was one?
Yeah, so there wasn't a most common nitrate number. So we had a pretty big range of nitrate values. We had everything from essentially almost no nitrate there, from some soils that had lost a bunch of it and had gotten no nitrogen, the 0N treatments for a couple years. But there wasn't like a most common, I will say that we had a good range of them overall.
But I think, Jordan, that's kind of an interesting finding. For whatever reason, I'll just say historically in Ohio, maybe because we're not as large of dairy states or going from forage production systems into corn, we haven't, as an extension, as a university, haven't really promoted or really pushed hard on some of the nitrates, the early season nitrate testing. You go to places like Wisconsin and New York, where there's a much larger dairy industry, and you'll see more promotion of that within like the university system. And so, but not that this is an Ohio specific study, but just kind of across the board, we just didn't see a really strong relationship to how much nitrate or that available nitrogen in the spring versus what that overall effect on yield was, right? So there was, as you mentioned, bigger pieces there, how much nitrogen you fertilized with, and then what your soil health value was were larger drivers of that.
Jordan, we had a request if you could share up the frequently asked questions slide again. And there's a question about the cost of the soil health test at the, is that Missouri lab?
Yes. Yeah, so it should be in the neighborhood, depending on which things you get. Now, these are the things that we looked at here are by no means exhaustive in terms of soil health tests, but it's generally in the neighborhood of about $50. When I get there, I'm hoping to bring the cost down a little bit and see what we could do. But currently that's where we're at, but stay tuned.
Thank you. What forms of nitrogen are detrimental to soil health?
Yeah, good question. So I see, and I also see a couple questions about pH, and so I think that these are actually related, as John mentioned here. So I think the important thing to say here is that nitrogen fertilization that acidifies would be detrimental if you are getting your pH too low, right? So you want to keep your pH within the 6-7 range. That's something you get back usually on your standard soil test, when you get your regular old soil test. So just make sure that it's in that range and you keep it in there. And when you get up to something like 8, to Dave's question, then yeah, you will start to see some potential effects when you get to higher pHs.
Can I follow up on that, Jordan?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we recognize nitrogen is kind of a double-edged sword in terms of soil health. We recognize it's critically important for growth and productivity of crops, right? If we don't apply nitrogen in most of our cornfields in Ohio and most of the North, most of the Midwest and North Central region, we're not going to get the productivity that we otherwise would. That's not a, that's not a revealing statement that everyone is aware of that. If we don't get corn growth and productivity, we don't get roots going below ground and really kind of exploring the volume. And so there's been a lot of work looking at does nitrogen actually increase organic matter or decrease it? Well, it does both. It increases it by increasing production of the plant, of the crop and the roots that are in the organic matter that's going into the soil from that. And it also loses it by speeding up mineralization processes from the microbes. And so, high salt nitrogen is in a localized area detrimental to soil health, but can be in a generalized way really good for the entire soil health community of a field because of the fact that it's improving productivity. So what we do know is that when there's an excessive amount of nitrogen applied, or in excess of what the crop needs, that's when it really becomes detrimental and you're just burning up carbon, you're stimulating decomposition, a lot of respiration with no positive output or outcome from you as a producer. So that's what we're trying to avoid. But we understand, Jordan's study really showed this, is that we need nitrogen if we want to maintain our soil health. Yep.
Yeah. So I see a couple other questions here that I wanted to get to. So we did not have any organic only systems or certified organic ground, anything like that, but we did have lots of sites where we have several of these kind of management practices happening simultaneously. Everything from no-till with manure and a longer rotation, like we have several combinations of them. And I think that's one kind of benefit of this is that we did get a huge range of managements that are layered on top of each other. And that's maybe one benefit of doing lots of on-farm work, because, you know, people don't just use one management, one of these kind of conservation managements. They usually have a couple overlapping. So we did do that, and that was part of it. And then, sorry, Brianne has a question about soil health testing using grid. I don't want to speak for Steve, but they did this work. I don't remember the exact grid sampling size that they used, but they found that you really don't need to change your grid sampling for soil health any more than just regular soil testing.
Yeah, I'll just follow up really quick on that. We just did kind of a small pilot study looking at 3 different fields and 3 different growing regions in Ohio. And and as Jordan said, we just found that we don't have, at least right now, it just showed that our soil health indicators vary spatially about the same extent that our other kind of routine things like pH and soil test P, soil test K. So the recommendation coming from that is that, at least for now, we just don't believe that you need to do anything really different for soil health testing than you would for just if you were submitting that sample for a routine nutrient analysis.
There's a question that's got a couple likes. Do the biologicals that are being sold have any potential of impacting soil health?
So there's a lot of different biologicals being sold. So I can't really speak to specific ones, but and I also haven't worked with them myself. But from what I've seen so far, a lot of them don't have huge impacts on soil health. I guess my first answer would be to look at the soil health tests, see if they're actually moving the needle. If they are, then maybe we have a little bit more confidence that they are helping things out. But for now, I haven't seen much suggesting that they have a huge impact.
Steve, do you have any thoughts about that?
Not really. We've done a teeny bit of work. There's just not a lot of compelling evidence that we see that are like from other peer institutions that have looked at this or are looking at this that, and as Jordan said, it's kind of like, it's a wild world out there in terms of how, the types of biologicals, things coming on the market and then leaving the market at really kind of quickly cycling biologicals from a marketability perspective. And so I think that there is potential, of course, everyone believes that, but just seeing really consistent results and the efficacy of that is not what we'd like, and certainly not to the point where we're like ready to endorse anything. So.
Okay, so did any fields in this study implement multiple management practices like no-till and cover crops, and did this impact the results?
Yes, so we definitely had fields with multiple overlapping managements, and in how it impacted the results. I mean, you get higher soil health values, and so therefore, presumably you should get a little bit higher of a boost. So it does, the more you can move the needle, again, the more you can move the needle on how these soil health tests come out, the better it is. Not every management that people implement obviously is going to have the same effect everywhere.
Had a producer this year who had a legume cover crop, applied 3 tons of chicken litter, corn was planted. Forage sample showed 200 pounds of nitrogen. Mid-season corn was showing nitrogen deficient, yet soil sample showed 100 pounds of nitrogen. Any ideas what might have happened?
I mean, that sounds, I would probably need a little bit more information on that. Nitrogen deficiency, depending on how you look at it, if you're just doing it visually, it can look like other things as well. but that 200 pound or that 3 tons of chicken litter rather might not have had time to fully mineralize quite yet to become plant available. So that might not have been paying dividends quite yet, depending on when it was applied and et cetera. I would need a little bit more information on that before I could say for certain what I think is up.
And I'll just add that, we're talking about those types of sources, manure and cover crops, and those are, of course, organic fertility sources. And anytime we're dealing with that, and in soil health in general, we're talking about a biological system, right? And so there's uncertainty in terms of availability and mineralization turnover when we're dealing with biological systems. We have a dry summer, and a lot of that might not be available. So I think that we need to think about that, or at least recognize that, when we're relying on the microbes to turn pools over and do their kind of engineering in terms of chewing up organic material and making it plant available, then, we've got to recognize that there's uncertainty and some risk with that as well.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask another question, and then I'm going to show up the CCA credits for those of you that have to leave, but we can keep answering some of the other questions for those of you that want to keep asking questions. So since we are getting cleaner, less acid rain, cleaner air with less acid rain, it has been recommended that we add sulfur. How do we avoid decreasing the soil pH while adding sulfur?
Jordan, you want me to take that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not really one to work with sulfur.
Okay.
So
well, there's two primary sulfur sources that are dry, granular. That would be gypsum or elemental sulfur. Elemental sulfur actually lowers pH. If you're looking at ammonium sulfate, that would lower pH as well. Gypsum is a neutral salt, so that has really no effect on pH. If you're looking for a sulfur source without pH drop, then gypsum is your guide. Yep, that's what you're looking for.
So I see there's a question about how much extra nitrogen is needed to enhance soil health as we think about nitrogen fertilizer additions.
Yeah, that's a good question. I might have misspoke, actually. We do not need extra nitrogen to do that. It's just what happens. So in a particular growing season, about half of the nitrogen that a plant takes up is going to be from the soil. It's not actually the fertilizer. So when you're adding the fertilizer, that means that you're kind of just keeping that replenished, right? It's keeping those microbes keeping things moving along. So it's not necessarily that you need to add, 100 pounds for the plant and 20 pounds for the microbes or anything like that. It's just to kind of think of it as like grease to keep the microbial wheels moving there.
All right, thank you. Has anyone looked at plant exudates effects on the microbiology in the soil?
Yes, so this is kind of where a lot of this microbial magic happens, is plants are putting out their exudates, and they're both attracting certain types of microbes, and they're altering that root zone. And so that's kind of, it, like I said, it keeps the things moving there, and that's, that's the magic. When we do kind of more isolated lab studies, there are huge differences between N mineralization and N production by the soil microbial community when there's plant roots and when there's not. Plant roots are really the thing. They're driving this more than I think we initially expected.
Thank you. If soil test nitrogen is not linked to yield increases, does this imply fall nitrogen application is not as important as spring or in season? Did you compare fall versus pre-plant versus in-season nitrogen application rates and yield response?
Good question. So we actually, to make sure that we weren't over accounting for nitrogen rate, we only used studies in fields that applied spring nitrogen only. We didn't get any of the fall applied nitrogen. If we included fall applied nitrogen in there, there's a huge potential for loss, and we would be counting, if you will, the fertilizer, even if it wasn't potentially still there. So we didn't differentiate between fall and spring, or we didn't look at the differences between fall and spring applied nitrogen.
How about deep banding versus broadcast fertilizer?
I don't believe that we had any differences in method of application.
Yeah, what I recall is that all of the trials were either broadcast or band applied. Nothing that would be considered deep placement. Nothing more than 2 inches or so deep.
Yeah, all relatively just on the surface.
There's a question. Sorry to jump in, Mary, but there's a question about POX and starting values for POX and protein respiration. All of those we have. I just put a plug that we're going to be talking about results of e-fields in a few weeks. Elizabeth Hawkins and I will be doing that at another webinar. And I don't know, what is that, 3 weeks or so, 4 weeks from now. And we will be presenting kind of baseline data and looking at distribution of values across Ohio, so people can have some idea in terms of what we're dealing with for POX, what would be considered a good versus a medium versus a high POX value relative to your soils in your region. So we'll table that question for a few more weeks. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Considering rhizophagy, James White at Rutgers, how does this relate to nitrogen sources and the soil health?
I'm not super familiar so with James's work, so I don't think I can speak to that super confidently.
Okay, Steve, any thoughts? That's
No.
something we need to look into a little bit more, Ralph. All right, thoughts on humic and fulvic acids with the soil health piece and the nutrients being available with a good soil health?
So I'll just say that we recognize that there's a lot of work and a lot of activity in humic and fulvic acids. We've done some of the work and not seen immediate yield response. That is, we've ran probably 3 or 4 different trials, some in organic and some not, and we haven't seen a lot of response in a first year application. And that's really, it was just a single year observation. Those application rates are often very, very low, very small. So again, there's a lot of people out there doing it and talking good things about it. We believe that there's likely some benefit, but we just don't think it's, we have not seen a super consistent benefit. So, this is like a very similar topic. These biologicals or fulvic or humic substances is the same with soil health. We're talking about a biological system here. And as Jordan, talked about, fields differ and vary. And so responses are going to differ and vary as well. And so we don't have a lot to say about this. We just haven't found much to say that, there's a lot of consistent results. So
there's a few questions about manure in the Q&A. One, from a soil health perspective, is there an advantage to manure over cover crops, or are vice versa? Are they equal? Is there data on this? And another question is, does it make sense to apply manure to the bulk of before the soybean crop, so there are no surprises in the amount of mineralization? So I guess the questions are kind of about, is there information that you have about best practices for manure application and data that shows benefits of manure compared to other soil health enhancement practices.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I will re-emphasize here is that there's going to be a lot of it depends, and you know, is manure better than cover crop? Well, it depends on where you are, right? If you're in a heavier soil, maybe not. You know, again, I would have to know a little bit more information and kind of what your goals are, right? What's your goal with soil health, and that might kind of dictate which one is preferred.
Yeah, and it's a good time as well right now because there's a lot of, as you can see us struggling through some of these Q&As, we don't know a lot of these answers. There are still a lot of unanswered questions, and I will say that we are going to be, you know, we talked a little bit about this last week, and we'll talk about it over the course of this webinar series, but we are going to be continuing eField's work on soil health studies this coming year. And so if you have questions about this, you know, we encourage you to reach out to me, reach out to a county educator, and think about what might make sense from a soil health perspective, or, you know, getting samples analyzed through eFields and having a trial through eFields. So there are opportunities for soil health testing and to kind of learn some of these specific questions about your operation or what's going on in your county. If you're so inclined, that's an opportunity.
All right, thank you. We're getting close to 9 o'clock, so there are a few more questions, but I don't think we're going to be able to answer all of these questions today. There's a comment that there's some research out of Penn State looking at biologicals, so that's something that we'll need to look into, and it's good to have that information. So appreciate all of your questions. Know that you can contact us with questions provided to you. So thanks for coming today, and big thank you to Jordan for presenting his research, and to Steve for helping with Q&A. So appreciate you all for being here, and hope to see you next time, next Thursday right here at 8 o'clock with our cover crop talk.